Kylo Ren and Rey. Now, most people within the Star Wars community have come to accept that this current saga is mostly about these two characters and the connection that they share. Yes, I am talking about Reylo, and a lot of people are convinced that that's the way it's gonna go. However, even within the Reylo community, there is something that people are bothered by. This is, of course, the idea or theory that they will have a child in between episode 8 and episode 9. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that this child was conceived through them touching hands through the Force. And while this is a pretty wild idea, in this video I want to explain why it actually makes sense for all of the characters involved and the future of Star Wars films. What's up, everybody? I am, of course, Josh. This is the Den of Nerds. If you love Star Wars the way I do, subscribe to this channel. We're cranking out a ton of videos on the way to episode 9. Now, before I even get into a lot of my reasons and talk about theories and mythology and different things like that, I just want to say it's totally okay if you don't like this idea. In fact, when the virgin birth was introduced in the prequels for Anakin, a lot of people were not down with that either. And that's what I mean. It is totally okay for there to be things within Star Wars that you are not a fan of, and I hope that you don't hate this video. It's still fun to speculate about these things, to draw different conclusions, especially when you consider the mythic storytelling that is going on within Star Wars. And so that's where I want to start with this. I want to talk about mythology and metaphor and myth in general. Now, a lot of the basic principles in Star Wars are all based upon what is known as the monomyth. This is an idea of storytelling that is ingrained with almost every culture that has ever existed on the planet. Joseph Campbell, the popular philosopher, of course, deals with this idea a lot, and George Lucas was a student of Joseph Campbell and deliberately put in a lot of mythic metaphors into his Star Wars stories. In fact, George claims that the mythic underpinnings and the truth that is within these stories has a lot to do with the overall popularity of Star Wars. This is what Joseph Campbell says about mythology. He says it is an organization of symbolic images and narrative metaphors that explain the possibility of human experience and fulfillment within a given culture at a given time. And when it comes to those stories, virgin birth is always there. In fact, you can hardly find a culture or society that has stories that doesn't have at least one about a virgin birth. But again, it is not meant to be taken literally. In fact, a lot of psychologists and philosophers believe that the idea of the virgin birth actually refers to consciousness or spirituality entering the world of the animal. And so you can think of it like this: if paradise and the Garden of Eden is the perfect idea of a homeostatic animal environment, then consciousness or awareness entering into that is both the fall and the gift of God. You see, birth is actually a very animal thing, sexual intercourse. And if you look at the way most animals reproduce in the wild, it's kind of like savage. It's just primitive. There's not a lot of thought that goes into it. However, with humans, it's of course different. We choose our mates. We love our children. We think about ourselves in our children, and we're aware that we are passing our genes down. This is a spiritual idea, or at the very least an intellectual idea, and that is what is represented by the virgin birth. Now, in the diegetic world of Star Wars, the Force is pushing Kylo Ren and Rey together. And you can think of this as God, and I don't want to get too crazy with this idea here, but essentially what is happening is that the Force is waking up again and finding balance. Now, within the yin and yang, the balance is actually not the yin-yang, it is the line that runs through the yin-yang, that line that touches both darkness and light. And the idea of the two coming together and there being this new spirituality, this new awakening to the greater ideas of the Force, that is what is represented by the virgin birth. And so especially when you consider the birth of maybe a new line of Skywalkers, a whole new family saga to be told in future films, it's kind of important that that whole thing is predicated on the idea of a virgin birth. Even though in in this instance, it's not exactly a virgin birth because the two, of course, do have physical contact, and it's something like sex that is going on in that scene. Now let's talk about Rey, because I've seen, especially within the Reylo community, a lot of people being upset at Rey having to bear children and sort of being confused about her being that kind of a plot device. And I think that this perfectly is illustrated in the metaphor that you find with Adam and Eve and the serpent. A lot of psychologists have come to understand that story from Genesis and a lot of other stories that mirror it in other cultures to be about man and woman and consciousness. Most importantly, self-consciousness or awareness of one's being. You see, in this story, Adam gains consciousness from the woman. Eve, of course, gives the apple to Adam, and then he becomes aware. And this is meant to mimic the relationship between man and woman and self-consciousness. Women have been making men self-conscious since the beginning of time. A lot of this has to do with the way they reject men as mates. In human sexuality, it is always the man that is trying to have sex, trying to reproduce, and women, being the avenue to reproduction, have to be very restrictive. This idea constantly wounds men and makes them very aware of their shortcomings. This is an important part of human consciousness from the male perspective. Let's take The Force Awakens as an example. The end fight in the forest can be thought of in this way. Now, of course, it's, a little bit different than the story of Genesis, but what is happening here is that Kylo is not trying to hurt Rey. He's actually trying to turn her to his side. He's trying to win her over. And you can think of this as him attempting to be her mate. And she completely rejects him and actually fights back, wounding him in the process. I actually think that the wound that Kylo Ren wears is meant to mimic the wound that all men carry from one of the first rejections they get from a female. This makes him self-conscious. It is literal and metaphorical at the same time. Because if you haven't noticed, I really think this whole saga is about love and it's about relationships. And I don't know, that might piss you off, but that's the way I think it's going. So let's talk about Rey. Rey comes to see the good in Kylo Ren. She comes to have compassion and love for him. And despite the entire world telling her that that is a bad idea, that that's not what she should do, she ultimately decides to forsake all of that and go to try to save what she views as her male partner in some sense. The love she has and the falling for that love is sort of the sin that she does. I also find it very interesting that we are seeing this kind of heroism or the main perspective from at least equally the female viewpoint. I don't think that Kylo is the total focus of the saga. Obviously, Rey is a co-protagonist with him. But what's interesting is for the first time in this type of a mythic story, we are seeing both perspectives predominantly represented. And so from the female perspective, there is this loving sort of tender nature, not only with the way she views Kylo, because you have to remember, she is the one that reaches out her hand first. Kylo unmasks or takes the glove off of his hand and then is allowed to feel vulnerable after first attempting to get her and being rejected. And so there's essentially a lot going on from the female perspective. And I actually just watched an amazing podcast from Girls with Sabers that really opened my eyes to this idea. The idea that Rey is this feeling with the Force, the idea of this female version of connecting with the Force, which is very different from the male version. Finally, Snoke obviously represents the serpent in the garden. And this is a very interesting aspect to the Genesis story in general. Essentially, God makes paradise, but he puts the serpent or Satan into paradise. That's sort of puzzling, and I think it's meant to sort of introduce this idea of God as a paradox and the morality of God kind of like beyond our grasp. But in either case, Satan or Snoke or the serpent is an important character to get both Adam and Eve to attain consciousness. And Snoke, of course, puts their minds together. And I think this is a very deliberate idea introduced by the storytellers here. Snoke sounds like Snake. He looks a lot like Snake. And I think that this whole fruit of knowledge and the corruption that happens to Ben Solo is all sort of biblical in a sense. Now let's fast forward and sort of get to the point here. The idea is the punishment for the fall from grace, the cost of having consciousness, being aware yet again. And what is the punishment that is laid down for Adam and Eve? I mean, first of all, they're going to die. Adam, of course, has to work all of his life, sweat and blood. But the punishment for Eve, or the punishment for Rey, is the fact that she will have to bear children. And that's gonna really suck. And in some sense here, I think that this like mythic story is kind of explaining the burden of being a bearer of the child. The fact that, yeah, females in the biological sense definitely like harbor the most pain and frustration and just burden when it comes to reproducing the species. And so if you think of Adam and Eve and the snake represented by Kylo Ren, Rey, and Snoke, I think it makes a lot more sense as to why Rey would have the child. It's like I hear people saying like, a woman's job isn't just to procreate. Ah, man, it sucks that they're just gonna make her have children. And I'm like, yo, I'm with you. It totally sucks. But, you know, so does life. There's a lot of aspects of suffering and the nature of humanity that is mimicked in mythic stories. It's not a judgment on what it is supposed to be like. It's more like, no, this is reality and we have to accept it. Yes, it is unfair, but so is biology, so is nature, so is life. And so I don't think people should be getting upset if they do indeed give Rey a child and sort of position her character as the harbinger of the new line of Skywalkers. I think it's mythic. I think it's logical. I think it just makes total sense. Now let's talk briefly about why this makes sense for Star Wars in general. I mean, I've been a big proponent of the idea that we need to get to a place in Disney Star Wars where there are a lot more Force users, a lot more Skywalkers, and just a lot more going on when it comes to good versus evil. This is the perfect way to get there, and I think that this Force birth kind of a child that Kylo Ren and Rey would have would not only be something that would force them together and force them to have sort of a secret from the galaxy, which is also a theme of intimacy, relationships, and how communities work. But I think it might lead us to like a new Vader or a new Luke Skywalker. We don't know how this boy is going to end up turning, whether he'll be light or whether he will be dark. But there's always sort of this pinnacle keystone character that tips the scale of the balance of the Force, and nature, or the Force itself, sort of corrects that in a way that manifests itself in a war or a conflict. Also, if they're in general pushing for the idea of a love connection as the predominant theme of this saga, that usually ends up, at least in the heterosexual sense, in a child. That is kind of how that works. So even though this is kind of weird and a strange idea and maybe completely unfair to both characters, because like, yeah, they didn't choose to have this child, I think it also mimics nature, it mimics mythology, and there's precedence for it, even within the diegetic world of Star Wars. I mean, Anakin was a virgin birth after all. Also, Rian Johnson did say that's the closest thing we're going to get to a sex scene in Star Wars, and I just cannot see him saying that for any other reason than, yeah, it's going to end up producing a child. So those are some of my ideas. I just wanted to explain why I think it makes sense for Star Wars to do this hand-touchy Force birth child. So let me know, did I maybe convince you that this will happen? Do you still think it's whack as hell? Whatever your thoughts are about this, let me know in the comment section below. Now I want to shout out Cornelius Clark, who got the nerd card question correct in my video talking about the future of DC movies. You definitely know your stuff when it comes to DC, so shout out to you, and we're going to do another nerd card question right now. And the question is, how old was Master Luke Skywalker when he died in The Last Jedi? He was no spring chicken, but I want to know exactly how old he was when he passed. Answer that question in the comment section below. As I always say, I hope you are having an awesome and nerdy day, and I will see you in the next video.